Alrighty. If you're just joining us now on Facebook or on the website, or if you're watching this later, we welcome you. Thanks for joining. Today, Elroy is preaching from Micah. We're continuing our Advent series, anticipating. We're remembering when they were first anticipating the coming of Jesus, who we celebrate his birth at Christmas. But Jesus isn't just Christmas. Jesus isn't just the point of Christmas. Jesus is the purpose of our whole lives and your students. So if you're watching this and you don't know him, we invite you to listen and hear and ask, who is this Jesus that all these Christians and other people talk about at Christmas? And but he wasn't just born then and died. He's alive now, and he is our King, our God, and we're worshiping him. And he has made us, given us new life. And so we invite you to explore that with us. All right, I'm going to hand it over to Elroy. Thanks, brother.
Thanks, Jay. I'll continue our series walking through the Advent, and again, I want to focus on Micah chapter 5. But as I did last week, I would like to begin in 1 Peter and remind you of what I said then. In 1 Peter chapter 1, we see in verse 10, concerning this salvation, the prophets who prophesied about the grace that was to be yours searched and inquired carefully, inquiring what person or time the Spirit of Christ in time was indicating when he predicted the sufferings of Christ and the subsequent glories. And so Peter talks about how the prophets of the Old Testament, with great carefulness, if that's a way to express it, they searched diligently and inquired carefully what was to come, when the Christ was to come, when the Christ was to suffer, when the Christ was to be exalted. And then Peter concludes that segment with this phrase that has always fascinated me. But he says in verse 12 of 1 Peter 1 that it was of these things that angels long to look. And so this salvation that is ours, this grace that is ours, this salvation that the prophets looked forward to with great anticipation, angels actually long to look into these things. And it puzzles me when I read the story of that Quiana just finished reading for the kids. This wise men travel from a great distance. They're from the east. They actually come to Jerusalem expecting to find the king there. They ask, where is the king that is to be born, or that was born? And Herod is quite troubled. The scribes and the Pharisees, they begin to look and search the scriptures, and they tell him, well, he's going to be born in Bethlehem. But instead of following the wise men to go to Bethlehem, they stay put. And I often wonder if we as believers, we as Christians, we as individuals in the church, do we long to look into the salvation that is ours? Is this something we desire greatly, or are we enamored with the things of this world far too much? And so I thought over the course of 3 weeks, what we would do is we would look at the prophecy that is recorded in Matthew chapter 2, the prophecy that comes out of the book of Micah. And so if you have your Bibles, turn to Micah chapter 5, book in the Old Testament, Micah chapter 5, and those first 6 verses, and we will read them again. And last week we looked kind of at the history and understood who Micah is, etc. But today I want to dive into these 6 verses. Micah chapter 5. Now muster your troops, O daughter of troops. Siege is laid against us. With a rod they strike the judge of Israel on the cheek. But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from of old, from ancient days. Therefore he shall give them up until the time when she who is in labor has given birth. Then the rest of his brothers shall return to the people of Israel, and he shall stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. and they shall dwell secure. For now he shall be great to the ends of the earth, and he shall be their peace. When the Assyrians come into our land and treads in our palaces, then we will raise against him 7 shepherds and 8 princes of men, and they shall shepherd the land of Assyria with the sword, and the land of Nimrod at its entrance. And he shall deliver us from the Assyrian when he comes into our land and treads within our border. Let me pray. God, these are your words, they're not mine. And I ask that the same spirit that moved Micah to record these words will be the same spirit that teaches and instructs us even now. And so, God, I ask that you speak to us as only you are able. In your precious name we pray. Amen. Last week we looked at kind of the history or the context in which Micah wrote. Remember, Micah, his name means who is like Yahweh, or who is like the I am. Micah lived in a time of Judah and the northern tribes, but when there was a great decline, he would have lived in the era when the northern tribes were decimated by the Assyrians. But he also lived in the time when much of Judah was decimated by the Assyrians. They actually came up to the border, up to the gates of the city of Jerusalem, and they weren't allowed to go further because of God's great miracle. But they decimated much of Judah. He lived in a time of the next stage was going to be a season when within 100 years, Judah would also be carried off in captivity. And so we walked kind of through the history last week, but today I want us to, as you've noticed the title, A Once and Future King. I stole that from the Tyndale Old Testament commentary, which Watke actually titles this section, The Once and Future King. And as you have noticed, nothing I say is original. And if there is anything I say that's original, probably start looking elsewhere. But the once and future king. Today I want us to look at the once part, and next week, Lord willing, we'll look at the future part. Verses 1 and 2 really tie into that. Notice the beginning, now. Don't lose sight of that word. This is the third time in just a few verses that we see this word. Go back to verse 9. Now, why do you cry aloud, of chapter 4? And then in verse 11 of chapter 4, now many nations. It's almost like Micah, if he was living today, he would have posted on Facebook verses 9 and 10, and he would have started with the present distress, the now, but he would have moved very quickly into a future salvation. And then on Tuesday, he would have posted now, the present distress, and then moved into the future salvation that he was anticipating. And then on Wednesday, he would have posted chapter 5, verse 1, now, the present distress. And then in that same post, the future salvation. Do you see what he's doing? He's telling us this is our situation now. But there is a time coming where there's hope. And so we want to look at his third posting. Now, muster your troops, O daughter of troops. Siege is laid against us. What's he talking about? Well, we're not completely sure. Quite likely, I think he's talking about at this very present moment, 701 BC, the great superpower, the Assyrians, they have surrounded the city of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is the people, the remnant, the small group that is left is hiding out behind the walls of Jerusalem. The Assyrians have already conquered much of Judah and have put an end to many of the nations around, including their brothers and sisters in the northern 10 tribes. Sennacherib has insisted that his men begin to speak to the Jews in their own language, in which they are going to be mocking the King Hezekiah where they're going to begin to say, don't trust in Hezekiah and don't trust in your Lord. After all, the gods of the other nations haven't saved them. You can read about this in Isaiah 36 and 35 and 36, 37 as well. And read this with great clarity. I encourage you to read that section. I think he's talking about that. Others think, well, no, he's actually anticipating the siege a little over 100 years later, when the Babylonians would once again surround the city, but this time they would destroy Jerusalem. And so Micah says, now muster your troops. He uses the word troops rather than the word army. And I think there's a reason for that. What they can muster is so small and insignificant that it doesn't even match up to an army. It's just a simple, a small little army. Now muster your troops, O daughter of troops. Muster your troop. Who is this daughter? Earlier in the book, he calls Zion the daughter of Zion. He calls the remnant that is still left the daughter. And so he says to those who are holed up in Jerusalem, muster your troops. Siege is laid against us. We're walled up. Now, in the language where he says muster your troops, there is also a translation, you might find it in the new, in the NET translation, that says slash yourselves. And scholars wrestle with which piece should we use, which phrase is the best phrase. But the Hebrew actually encompasses both of them. And so there's an element, not only muster up your troops, as insignificant and powerless as impotent that might be, there's also this sense where they're mourning and grieving. This is a situation where the people in Jerusalem have come to an end of themselves. There's no more hope. There's grief, there's sorrow, there's mourning. And Micah goes on, with a rod they strike the judge of Israel on the cheek. The language of rod is the language of a shepherd's staff. A shepherd's staff is used to care for the flock. If the flock has fallen and needs to be pulled out of a crevice in a rock or something, they would use the staff. The staff would nudge the sheep in the right direction, but the staff would also be used to beat the enemy. The same language eventually would become, the same word would eventually be used for God's discipline on his people. The same word would be used for the scepter of a king. And the language here is, with a rod they strike the judge of Israel. Who's doing the striking? It's the Assyrians, likely. Maybe the Babylonians, certainly in the future. But who do they strike? They strike the judge of Israel. He doesn't say the king of Israel, which is interesting. You remember Joshua rose up to prominence, and after the time of Joshua, the judges rose up. But the judges were meant to deliver the people of Israel. And the judge, the king, likely Hezekiah, maybe Zedekiah in the future, they were so impotent that the great Assyrians mocked them. They struck them on the cheek. They slapped them in the face. Throughout the Old Testament, the language of being slapped in the face is a language of humiliation. You're so powerless that you cannot even defend yourself. I'll tell you a story about my grade 7 year. I had this coming, but I'll tell you the story anyways. I was a young man, and I was walking with a couple of my friends through the school, and I noticed one of the guys from grade 8, and he had a name that was easy to rhyme with, and so I decided to invent a little rhyme that mocked him, and I won't share that in case he's watching, but with my friends around me and he alone, I mocked him. And then I proceeded into the the school gymnasium. And I believe at that time we were having an intramural floor hockey tournament, and my team wasn't playing. So I was just watching. And as I'm watching the other teams playing, I noticed that the grade 8 boys, remember I was in grade 7, the grade 8 boys had cornered off every entrance of the gym. The problem wasn't that the fellow that I mocked was part of the crowd. The problem was they also had one of the guys who in grade 8 was growing facial hair and was over 6 feet tall. And then there was the other fellow I remember. He was already the size of middle linebacker. He could have been playing for the Stampeders, and he was only in grade 8. And you need to remember, my height didn't start happening until after grade 7. And suddenly I realized I was in trouble. I stayed in the gym as long as I could. The bell rang, I stayed. And finally I was like, I gotta go. And so I started walking through, and the grade 8 boys congregated around me. My friends were now gone. And as we walked, and as they chided me, as we made our way to my home room, the fellow that I had mocked, he began to swing and hit me. The punches to the face were not as painful as my humiliation. I couldn't even stand up and defend myself. I knew that if I tried to defend myself, or if I tried to fight back, you remember the guy with the facial hair and the guy who's a linebacker? They were in the crowd. I was defenseless. That's what's kind of going on here, but to a greater degree. The nation of Israel, the people in Jerusalem, the remnant, they're holed up in Jerusalem. And with the rod, they're being struck by the Assyrians. Their king Hezekiah is being mocked. He's being humiliated. He has no power to overcome them. Now, if you know the story, Hezekiah actually turns to the Lord, the God who has the power to overcome. And in 701 BC, God gives a victory, not because of Hezekiah's strength, but because of God's strength. But over 100 years later, King Zedekiah wouldn't turn to the Lord. The Babylonians would come in and demolish the city. And so that's the now. That's the present situation that Micah is writing in. And then we get to verse 2. But now, but you. Who's the you? Well, that's the daughter. No, that's not the you. But you, O Bethlehem, Ephrathah, that's the you. He's talking about a town just outside of Jerusalem. And he says of them, you are too little to be among the clans of Judah. You are so small, yes, physically small, but so insignificant. You are not a political power. You are not the Jerusalem. You're not the place where kings arise from. You are of no significance. In fact, when Joshua actually names off the borders of the tribe of Judah, he mentions a number of cities, but he does not mention Bethlehem. It is so small and insignificant. Even in the book of Micah, when the Assyrians are marching through Judah on their way to Jerusalem, a number of cities are mentioned, but Bethlehem is not mentioned. They are too small. They're too insignificant. If you notice, when Jay and Quiana read from Matthew chapter 2, the phrase is a little different in Matthew. Matthew's quoting Micah, quoting the Greek translation of the Hebrew text. And in Matthew we read, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. It sounds like you put a different twist on it. And you go, okay, what's going on there? Well, I think Matthew actually highlights what the intent of the passage is saying, because in Micah chapter 5, verse 2, but you, O Bethlehem, Bethlehem means the bread basket. Ephrathah means a place that is fertile and rich. Yes, it's little and insignificant, But it's not the least, because who comes from there? David. Do you remember? Do you remember the story that Samuel goes to the town of Bethlehem, where Jesse lives and his sons? And David is anointed king. David's from Bethlehem. But you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me. Hold it. David came from Bethlehem. Who's he speaking of? Who shall come forth? There is one to come from Bethlehem, Micah says. Now, I want you to notice in verse 2 of Micah chapter 5, from you, from Bethlehem, shall come forth for me. Who's the me? Who's doing the talking here in Micah chapter 5? Well, you have to go all the way back to chapter 4, verse 6. In that day, declares the Lord, the Yahweh, the great I am, I will assemble the lame and gather those who have been driven away and those whom I have afflicted, and the lame I will make the remnant, and those who are cast off a strong nation. And the Lord will reign over them in Mount Zion from this time forth and forevermore. And so God is speaking. And God says, I'm going to gather the lame, the broken, the distressed, those who've been running away, and I'm going to make them a remnant, a great nation. And he says, and then God says, I, the great I am, I'm going to reign. I'm going to be your king. And now in chapter 5, verse 2, the great I am, the Lord himself, God himself says, from you, O Bethlehem, shall come forth for me, what? A ruler. I thought God was going to rule. The language for me is so similar to what we see in 1 Samuel chapter 16. 1 Samuel chapter 16 is where David is anointed king. And let me just read this for you. Verse 1, the Lord said to Samuel, how long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? And if you know the story, Samuel has just gone to King Saul and has just said, because you have disobeyed, I'm going to tear the kingdom away from you, pull it away from you, and I'm going to give it to another. And now Samuel's dejected. Of course he's dejected. Because of this tearing away, the Philistines would overcome the Israelites. This was going to bring harm to his nation, and Samuel is discouraged. He's down, and God says to Samuel, quit moping about. How long are you going to grieve? Notice what he says after that. Verse 1, fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons. God says to Samuel, I have provided a king for my purposes, for my plan to accomplish what I want. And now, several hundred years later, through the prophet Micah, God says a very similar thing. From you shall come forth, from you, Bethlehem, shall come forth for me, for my plans, for my purposes, one who is to be a ruler in Israel. Now, I've said we were talking about today, not the future king, but the once king. Notice the last phrase in verse 2. Whose coming forth is from of old, from ancient days. This king that is to come, we are told, his coming forth is from of old. His coming forth is from ancient of days. And almost everyone agrees that what he's saying here is his coming forth is is from the line of Jesse and from the line of David. And what God is doing here is fulfilling his promise to David. And although David's descendants seem to be impotent and powerless, same thing, I guess, but you know what I'm trying to get at. God is going back to the root. He's going back to the source. He's going back to Bethlehem to find another king. But this king is going to come from the family of David, just like God had said in 2 Samuel chapter 7. But I don't want to end there. This language of Ancient of Days has caused many Hebrew scholars to scratch their head. For that same word in the Hebrew is used elsewhere. So, for example, in Psalm 90, verse 2, Moses writes, "Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God." If you have an NIV in front of you, in Micah chapter 5, verse 2, there's a little footnote. And instead of simply saying from Ancient of Days, there's a little footnote that says, or from everlasting. This ruler doesn't just come from David. Micah says that this ruler will come from everlasting. And so now, when the wise men travel to Jerusalem, and they says, "Where is this King of the Jews to be born?" And the scribes and the Pharisees, the chief priests, they go, "You know what? He's going to be born in Bethlehem." They bring him back to this chapter. But the one who is to be born in Bethlehem, according to Matthew chapter 5, verse 2, is one who has always been. And isn't that what Christ says in John chapter 8? Oh, it gets him in trouble, but he says very clearly, "Before Abraham was, I am." In other words, Abraham lived around about 2000 BC. Well, before him, I was. But that's not exactly how he says it, but he says, "Before Abraham was, I am." Using the very language of the Lord, the one who's declaring Micah chapter 5, verse 2, the one who says that he will reign over Jerusalem, over Mount Zion, the one who says he will bring forth a king, a ruler from Bethlehem. Who is this I am? It's none other than God himself. And when Jesus said that to the Jews in John chapter 8, they picked up stones because they knew what he was saying. They knew he was saying he's God. You know, I look at this passage and I marvel. And I go, okay, what do I do with it? What's our present situation? I'm surrounded, as you see. We've got the Christmas garb up. If you go to the other room, the tree's up, the garland's up across on the stairwell, and we're decked out in Christmas. But this Christmas will be like none that we've ever experienced. Typically, this time of year, our family, we've had the church family in our home by now, and we love doing that. We've had our neighbors in our home typically this time of year, but not this year. The province has said we can't have anybody over because the globe is in a pandemic. On Wednesday, Lynn and I will be celebrating our 31st wedding anniversary. And what a gift, what a blessing that we are still together. It speaks more of Lynn than me. It speaks more of the Lord than either of us. And typically we like to get away or go do something or get away to the mountains, but because Lynn has been in isolation since last Saturday because she came in contact with somebody. But now we are all in isolation because she was tested positive. And as of late last night, Joshua was also tested positive. And so we can't even go for a walk. Christmas is going to be different. We always look forward to Christmas Eve. For 31 years now, our family has either gathered around in Ohio around Lynn's family's table, or we've gathered with friends and family around a table here. And some of you have been part of that, and we can't invite you, and we wish we could. On Christmas morning, usually the family gathers, and we just kind of pajama day and open gifts and eat food and such like that. And well, Caleb's going to be staying in Toronto, and Jay and Rebecca, even though they're only 5 minutes away, they won't be coming over. This is our reality. This is our now. But this has always been the now in our world. We've always been in a global pandemic. They've looked different. Sometimes it's been a war. Sometimes it's been the Spanish flu. Sometimes it's been fires or whatever. And all of that because of Genesis chapter 3. Sin has become our master. Sin is our master. It rules over us. And the result of sin is death. And the reality is that's what we have to look forward to, every one of us. We are powerless. We are surrounded by the great 8 boys called sin and death. But we have a king who willingly was allowed, who willingly allowed death to strike him in the cheek. He was humiliated on our behalf. He took our punishment. That king is none other than the ruler that came from Bethlehem. And that king gives us hope if we turn to him in humility and say, Lord, I need you. Would you help me? Would you overcome sin and death in my life? That's the king we have to worship. That's the salvation and the grace that the angels long to look at. They marvel to look at this. That's actually the meaning of Christmas. And so even though the trappings may look different this year, Christmas has not changed. The same king was born, and that same king died on our behalf, and that same king is coming again to rule and to reign. And that's what we remember, and that's what we look into, and that's what we long for. And so, Community Grace, I hope and pray that this message just isn't so old and commonplace for you that it doesn't even do anything for you. I hope and pray that as you hear the message again and again and again, that you'll marvel at this great King. Let me pray. Lord, I love you. Your love is astounding and beautiful and grand and great. Thank you. And Lord, even though you had the power to bring down your angels and stop the humiliation, you allowed your son, and your son willingly went to the cross on our behalf. You were spit upon, your beard was pulling out, you were slapped, and you were put to death on our behalf. Thank you. But you rose from the dead, never to die again. You sit upon the throne. You rule over us, your people, your new creation, your holy nation. Oh Lord, that's what you do. And you are coming again. And every knee shall bow, and every voice shall proclaim you as Lord. I look forward to that day. Father, I pray that this Christmas season, that we would worship you. Your love and our affections for you would just grow and flourish, because we marvel that our present situation, our life on earth now, is not what it ought to be. But oh Lord, to know you and to be with you, to be loved by you, is a joy inexpressible. We love you, Lord. Thank you for your love for us. In your precious name we pray.